Well, let's bring in Michael Shurkin, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington. Michael, how do you see the current situation?
The current situation really is terrible. There's very little likelihood of a diplomatic solution. I don't really see how the junta could be talked into sort of backing down. And also the idea of a military intervention seems just horribly risky to me. The ECOWAS countries do have the means to do it. I mean, collectively, they can absolutely pull it off. But what is it, and what would it look like, and what good would it do? And it's just very difficult to imagine how that could have a positive result. So right now, it's sort of like a standoff, and it's hard to see how this has a good resolution. And I think ultimately, so go on.
No, it's a good point you were making. In some ways, it seems as though the ECOWAS group, having threatened military intervention, having had a deadline passed, and the military regime apparently ignoring that, setting up their own cabinet government in the meantime, that almost between a rock and a hard place, with calls for peace from the outside, from the US and Europe as well. How much of a sense do you have that the voices from the US, from Europe, are being listened to by the ECOWAS group to perhaps steer some narrative?
I really don't think they're being listened to, and I think this is part of the problem, that a lot of people tend to see ECOWAS as sort of a puppet of Western interests, specifically France. I don't read it at all that way. I think the countries that are part of ECOWAS and the countries that are pushing for action are doing it for their own interests and their own reasons. I mean, of course, still looking to see if there's any kind of international support. But at the same time, I see no reason to think that this is all in any way being driven by, certainly not driven by quote unquote Western interests. I think what matters far more is the internal politics of these countries, right? So President Tinubu of Nigeria has to deal with the fact that he has a relatively weak political position within his own country. He was only recently elected. It was a very contested election. And there's not that much enthusiasm in his own country for any kind of military intervention. I think all the other leaders in ECOWAS have to think about the same sort of thing.
It's a very good point, actually. So there are some analysts in Nigeria saying that it was a mistake in the past few days for President Tinubu not to speak to military regimes in Burkina Faso, in Mali, despite the fact there have been coups there, because we've ended up in a situation where both countries have announced that they will side with Niger. What's your take on that?
Well, Burkina Faso and Mali there's really very little they can do to help Niger. So it's not like there's going to be some military coalition between those three countries that will be of any importance. And also, even in terms of, they talked about economic aid in order to overcome the sanctions. But again, there's really very little that Mali and Burkina Faso can possibly do to help Niger. So I don't think so. I mean, the larger question is, there's always a problem. Like, if one takes a principled stance against military juntas, then what happens is one risks burning bridges with them, especially since there's nothing you can do about it. Whereas if you don't take a principled stance and you basically say, hey, whatever goes, so we're going to work with these military regimes, then what happens is you're also giving green light to sort of indicating that there's really very little risk in people's countries to do coup d'etat. And there's also, there's a lot of principles at stake, and it risks undermining the entire region in terms of civil-military relations. I could go on from this, but there's just so many negative consequences for doing either or that it's hard to sort of retrospectively say, oh, somebody was wrong to have condemned something or to have supported something, because both options are really terrible.
Well, in a sense, it's a very difficult path to look both outside in to work out where to go next, and also for those leaders to know where this is going. It seems the situation is very hard to control. The regime calling for people to take to the streets today in the capital, Niamey. The other thing, in the midst of this, 16 days on, we've had one photo of Mohamed Bazoum, the president, apparently smiling in this photo that we've seen. That's it. Now, since then, we've had increasing fears, first by the UN, Antonio Guterres, saying that their food has been restricted. They're hearing reports from this one phone call he's made, eating dry rice at one point, apparently. And now we've got the African Union saying that his conditions are deteriorating.
It's small of the junta. I mean, it's a terrible situation. I also can't think of any precedents. I mean, in the previous coup, there always seemed to have been some concern to protect the health and well-being of the the outgoing executive. They just, get him out of here. That was always the impetus. Like, we're happy to get him out of here as soon as possible. And that does not seem to be the case. And I see that the junta seems to think that they're going to use him as a human shield, which certainly doesn't put them in a good light. And I'm also concerned that it's going to serve as a pretext for interventions. Already I heard President Ouattara of Cote d'Ivoire yesterday saying that the holding Bazoum hostage was tantamount to an act of terrorism. That kind of rhetoric shows that holding him hostage, in effect, is escalatory, and it tends to fuel kind of extreme rhetoric that I think could put everybody in a very dangerous situation.
Just a brief point, Michael, maybe I'm putting you on the spot here, but if given your experience of dealing and analysing previous coups and the situation in the Sahel and Africa, where do you see this going?
Odds are what happens is that everybody's going to end up acquiescing to a military junta in Niger. I mean, because it seems to be the least worst option. And so I feel like sooner or later that's what's going to have to happen. Plus, the longer it takes to organize a military intervention, the more time the junta has to entrench itself. And so politically, it becomes more and more implausible to do anything about this. The only question is how much damage is going to be done in the region in terms of relations between the different countries, relations with the West, relations with the United States, certainly relations with France. And then, of course, there's always that question lurking in the background of relations with Russia.
Michael, great to hear your thoughts on this. Michael Shurkin, analyst in Washington, D.C. for the Atlantic Council.
Thank you.